Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And for today, we're happy to welcome Paul Beck back for his second session this week in the Chautauqua Lecture Series. Paul is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Senior Research Associate of the Mershon Center for National Security Studies, and we are fortunate he will be joining us all week to share multiple lectures on our theme, Preserving Democracy by the People. And today's session is partisan polarization across the world. The U.S. is not the only country experiencing high levels of polarization, and this talk views polarization across nationally and makes comparisons using surveys conducted in more than 4 dozen country elections on how particular electoral systems can affect polarization. As a reminder, Paul will be back tomorrow morning at 10:30 for a talk on current threats to democracy. And one thing I do ask is if you please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Paul Beck.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. It's good to be here again. I'm going to talk again today about political polarization, but this time I'm going to expand the scope of the discussion beyond the United States to talk about polarization in other countries and how those other countries compare with the United States. Let me just state, as I think I did yesterday, my position at the outset of this. Partisan polarization has become an issue in modern times. We see it here, of course. We see it almost every day here, certainly during an election campaign. My own feeling is that some polarization is an essential feature of a democracy. People disagree on important issues, and there are differences. Those differences often are organized around the party competition in an election or even in between elections, and that's natural, and I think we want that. We want the issues of the day to be debated with people articulating good positions, persuasive positions on each side of the issue, which helps us decide where we fall on a particular issue. Large differences, however, are dangerous, particularly if they grade over into a feeling that people on the other side are enemies and people on our side are just friends. And when you get into this friends versus enemies kind of mentality, you have a danger of extremism, you have a danger of violence around election time. And we've seen this in other countries, we've seen this to a degree in the United States as well. Certainly if you go back to January 6th of 2021, there was violence over the results of the election. That's not something we're used to in this country, but there it was on January 6th. When you have this kind of extreme polarization, it's also very hard to get the kind of compromise on legislation, on policies, that is necessary to be able to go forward and solve the kinds of problems that we face. The United States, as I don't have to tell you, as you know, faces some really serious problems going forward. And we've got to be able to deal with those problems in basically a bipartisan way so that we can get at least a modicum of agreement on each side of the issue. Well, what I'm going to do today is focus on voter polarization over the top government and opposition party leaders in 51 different country elections. I'm going to use surveys that were conducted, I should actually be using this. I'm going to use surveys that are being conducted or have been conducted by the Comparative Political Elections Project that I've been a party to for several decades. I'm going to talk about why it varies across elections, polarization that is, what countries stand out as the most polarized of countries, and why they're in that dubious, as I would put it, position. And then finally, I'll talk about the other grounds on which people disagree or are polarized across these various countries. These countries are different in many, many respects. And some of those differences really have to do with political polarization and are, quote, causes, end quote, or reasons behind polarization. Others really don't have very much to do with it. The data that I'm going to draw upon, and of course, political scientists like to use data. So what I'm going to be doing here is drawing from surveys that were conducted by the Comparative National Election Project. The project was founded in the late 1980s. I was one of the founders of it those many years ago. Since then, we have conducted over 70 surveys in elections really across the world, kind of an eclectic set of countries that we have drawn from. This goes between 1990 and 2023. The advantage, by the way, of having it over time is that in some of these countries where we've conducted multiple surveys, we can compare them over time. And then, of course, we can compare a whole bunch of countries at any point in time, all the way up to the present. I'm not going to talk about some of our most recent surveys because I haven't really had time to analyze the data that came from them. Two of them were conducted in 2023, one in Argentina, which is a highly polarized country. I already know from looking at the preliminary results. And Spain also in 2023. Not nearly as polarized as Argentina, but some polarization there. And then we have surveys that are in the field right now, as we say, interviews being conducted in Mexico, in Uruguay later this year, in the United States after the 2024 election, in Indonesia between now and then. One of our colleagues who's at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland is a specialist on Africa. And he's conducted many of the South African surveys that are embedded in our Comparative National Election Project. He has a research proposal in that has made it through the really competitive first round in the competition for funding and is now in the second round. He hasn't heard yet, but it's to do surveys in 6 African countries, one of which would be South Africa itself. And we're hopeful that they will add to the picture that we have of these contrasting surveys. What we do, by the way, as the managers of CNEP, my colleague Dick Gunther and I at Ohio State University, is that we first harmonize them. That's a technical term that we have adopted, I guess. And what that means is that we are looking at the same questions and the same response options across countries, across surveys, so that we can compare them. Now that's a tricky thing to do, by the way, because if you think of this, we are conducting surveys in some countries in languages that are very different from English. And sometimes a question that looks so good in English doesn't really travel very well to Mexico or to some other country, and so we have to make those adjustments. We rely on the indigenous research team to make those judgments, to clear them with us, but to basically make the call as to how they ought to translate these questions. Every once in a while they'll say, this question doesn't work in my particular country. We need to change the wording somewhat. Or the options that you offer to people when they're responding to this survey really don't comport with options people are used to in these countries, and so we need to modify those to some degree. Well, the harmonization is something that we have to do, and then what we do is we take each of these surveys and merge it or pool it into a large data file. That data file now has, I think if I remember right, 65 different country surveys in it. And all that we have to do is say, well, we want to know what people feel about the current government. There's a variable in the survey that tells us how people feel about the current government. We click on that variable in our analysis package, and we can either get it laid out country by country, or we can look at what the total is across all these countries. We now, by the way, have almost 110,000 respondents to our surveys across these countries. And so it's a gigantic task to be able to do first the harmonization, and then secondly, what we call the merging or the pooling of these data into one data file. We, by the way, release these data then for use by scholars, really anybody who wants to make use of them. They're posted in our website, which is u.osu.edu/CNEP. You can go there for more information on our surveys. You can see who our collaborators are. I should also add, by the way, that we are dependent upon researchers in the individual countries where we are conducting the surveys. They're the ones doing the surveys. They're the ones raising the money to pay for the surveys. They're the ones who, in the primary instance, are analyzing the data for their country, and then in turn analyzing the data for their country in the context of all these other countries that we have in the CNEP project. Okay, I'm going to talk about today what I talked about yesterday as well, which is called affective polarization. And these are differences in likes and dislikes, basically. Favorable versus unfavorable evaluations of top governmental and opposition party leaders. So it's a comparison of two different leaders. That works pretty well in most countries because two candidates for the top office in the presidential election often are garnering the major share of the votes. Every once in a while it doesn't work very well, and we have analyzed third candidates and built them into our analysis, sometimes fourth candidates. That's very tricky. I'm not going to bore you with how we do that because it gets to be very complicated, actually, but we do have those scores indeed. We ignore smaller parties. If they don't elect enough legislators in a legislative or parliamentary election to top a standard of, I think it's 5% of the legislature, we don't include those leaders in there. We also could look at attitudes towards parties. What do you think, let's say, in this country of the Democrats or of the Republicans? We don't do it that way because there are some countries in our set of countries that don't really have stable parties. And people would say, I have no idea what these parties are. I can't evaluate them, but I do know who the candidates are for the various offices. The classic case of this is Indonesia, which has been part of our study for many, many years. In Indonesia, the parties change from election to election. The leaders change, of course, from election to election. They can run on one party ticket one time and a different party ticket another time. And so we don't really want to use parties to be able to make these comparisons across countries. But every country has a government party or a government leader and an opposition leader, whether they are members of parties or not, and we can make a comparison between those two. So it's affective polarization that we're looking at. It's the difference between favorable versus unfavorable evaluations of top government and opposition party leaders, just as it says on the slide. The question is, and I'm going to read it to you, as I read it, think about how you might answer it for the presidential election of 2024. Quote, we would like to know your feelings towards some political figures on a scale of 0 to 10. For example, if you feel very favorable towards one of the ones listed, you can give her or him a high score up to a 10. If you feel very unfavorable towards this person, you can give a low score down to 0. If you feel neutral, you should give them a score of 5 or give them a 5. So again, there's this scale, it's called a feeling thermometer scale. In the early days of survey research, when we were doing face-to-face interviews at the doorstep, and we did this in our 1992 US study, you would simply hand a card to the person at the door, or maybe in their living room, wherever, if they invited you in, which they sometimes didn't. And we'd hand them this card. The card was a card that showed a thermometer on it, anchored at one end by 0, the other end by 100 degrees, and people would put themselves or put their evaluation of a particular candidate on that feeling thermometer. Once we moved to telephones, we couldn't really do that. You know, imagine you've got somebody on the phone who is interviewing you in a survey, and they're saying, well, think of a feeling thermometer that ranges between 0 and 100 degrees. And you're thinking, what? What are you talking about? So we've gone to this 0 to 10 scale, which is much more manageable for people in a telephone survey. We no longer, at least in the US, use telephone surveys. Most people won't answer the phone. They certainly don't want to do a survey over the phone. And so what we do now, and it's a technique that has evolved over time, is we draw our respondents, the people that we ask these questions to, from a pool that's been established that may include 10 to 15,000 people in it. We send a message to them. We have this political survey coming up, or the firm that does the work for us, which is a firm called YouGov these days. They'll send a message to them. We have this political survey coming up. Would you be interested in participating? If they say yes, they are the ones who then get the questions asked of them. We always worry about whether the people who say yes are different from the people who would not say yes. And so we have ways to correct for that. I think those ways are, first, not infallible, but they're ways that have tended to work pretty well. Usually when we have an estimate of what the vote is going to be in an election, if we're doing the survey before the election, or what the vote has been in the election, we are almost exactly on target in terms of predicting the vote. Every once in a while, not. Every once in a while, those corrections have to be made afterwards to try to get that number right, but we want a representative sample of the public, of voters at least, in that particular election. We can also measure polarization, and we have in some ways, in some studies, on issues, on ideologies, liberal versus conservative, or left versus right. Between groups, we could measure polarization between, let's say, blacks and whites, evangelicals and mainstream Protestants, or whatever, and we've done some of that analysis. But what I'm going to look at today is just the top government and opposition party leaders. And what I'd like to show you first, and I'm going to flip over, well, let me talk about this for just a minute, and then I'm going to show you the figure that I think you probably have in a handout. Did somebody not get the handouts that were passed around? They're only $20, so you want to just ante up right away. John will be happy to take your money. No credit cards, just cash. Anyway, there are two lines you'll see on that figure 1A. The top blue line is where people are differentiated as to where they place the government and opposition candidates, either at 0 to 2, which is very low, very cool, very cold towards that candidate, versus 0 to 10, very warm, very favorable towards that candidate. And then there's a lower red line that shows extreme polarization. People who are locating one of the candidates at 0 and the other candidate at 10. And it's a comparison just of people who are in those categories, right? Who have one candidate at 0, the other candidate at 10. And so what you see in that figure, and in fact, I'm going to put the figure up here. What you'll see in that figure is the difference between 0 to 10 and 8 to 10, that's the blue line, and then the difference between 0 and 10, which is that bottom, I guess that's orange probably, or I think it was intended to be red, but it turns out to be orange. And what I've arrayed here, and I'll talk about this in some detail, is the first 20 or so countries. It was really too many countries at 51 country election surveys to want to array them along one single continuum. You would be going blind if you tried to read that. And so what I did was separate it into the top 20 or so, and then the next slide, figure 1B, is going to show the lower 20 or so. So among the top 20, you can see that what leads the way is the country, the survey we did in Mozambique in 2004. And many of you will say, where is Mozambique? Well, it's an African country. 10 years before, about 10 years before we did our survey, there had been a tribal civil war in Mozambique. And the estimate at the time was that 400,000 people lost their lives in that civil war. Many others were displaced, became refugees. There was incredible desolation of Mozambique. Almost 10 years later, they have this national election The two political parties in that election, the government leader and the opposition leader, were guess who? The leaders of the two tribes that had been the warring tribes in the earlier decade. And so it stands to reason that high levels of political polarization would result from that particular election. But look who is in a very close second place to Mozambique. It's the U.S. in 2020. It is right here. Less so in terms of extreme polarization, but certainly in this 0 to 2 to 8 to 10 differentiation, it's up there very high. The other one is a survey we just completed a couple of years ago, and that was in Brazil. Brazil had a very contentious, general election between Jair Bolsonaro and Luis Silva. Luis. And that election was very contentious. I'll come back to that later on because I want to talk in some depth about the difference between the U.S. and Brazil and the difference between U.S. and Brazil on the one hand and France in 2007 and Germany in 2007, which had much lower levels of polarization. Well, you could, if you turn your head sideways and you can kind of read along this axis right here, the horizontal axis, those are the countries and the year of that particular election, okay? So some of these elections come from a long time ago. Others are much more recent. And you can see that very quickly we move away from extreme levels of polarization towards levels, if you go down here to South Africa in 2014, it's 15%, or it's actually 14% of the public in South Africa was extremely polarized. Now, think about it for a minute. If 15%, or in the case of the US, 30% of people are seeing the two candidates at completely opposite extremes. One that they hate, really. The other one that they love, if you want to think of 0 as hate and 10 as love. That's a lot of people in any election. And it's enough to make that election a polarized election. But if you think of Mozambique at above 50%, or Brazil above 50% in the 0-2 versus 8-10, and at 45% in the extreme form of polarization, you've got a very polarized electorate. And as I said before, the US is here in this range right there. We've got a lot of polarization here, and you basically see it in American elections. Let me now, and I'll come back to that, I wanted to just show you figure 1B, which is the lower levels of polarization. And remember, I divided them about a half, so I just had a cutoff there. The important ones to pay attention to are the US in 1992, 20% polarized in that 0 to 2 versus 8 to 10 level, versus what, 50% in 2020? A big difference between 1992 and today. And it's a difference, by the way, again, let me go back to the former one. It's a difference that kind of grew over time from 2004 up to 2012. We don't have a 2008 survey, but we do have a 2016 survey, and then of course all the way to 2020. So a big contrast between 1992 and what we see in the 2000s. And that has been the steady march of polarization in this country, to the extent to which, by some measures anyway, it embraces half of the electorate. Let me talk about others here. Well, I'll come back to some of them later on, but you can see Indonesia, which we have surveyed, I think, 4 times now. We have a very wealthy colleague who runs the largest polling organization in Indonesia and is a professor at one of its universities. And our colleague, Saiful, has been very generous in running CNEP surveys in every election since he joined the project. He's an OSU PhD, so we have a hook into him, of course. He also comes back occasionally for football games, and we're always able to find him tickets to these games. We had a conference, I almost hesitate to tell you this, but we had a conference before the pandemic in Bali in Indonesia, which our friend Seifel financed. And he financed it, he put us up at a 5-star Marriott resort. He provided just wonderful meals for us. If any of us had brought our spouses or our children or grandchildren with us, he didn't pay for their airfare, but he did put them up in the hotel. And they were the ones enjoying Bali while we were closeted in some dark room talking about political science kinds of things. But anyway, Indonesia has very little polarization in its elections. Not that they aren't contentious, they are. But they aren't deeply polarized, at least in terms of affective polarization, in the way that American or Mozambique elections are. I wanted to make sure that I covered these points. Well, two other countries that have had, well, one other country that's had a considerable amount of polarization is Hungary. And this is in 2006. This is our last Hungarian survey because the firms that we have used have not been permitted to run surveys in Hungary because Hungary has gradually over time become an authoritarian country with authoritarian leadership. This was Orban's first election when he was a socialist. He no longer is a socialist. He is now, I think, would be in the category of probably right-wing authoritarian leaders. But nonetheless, there was a polarization level there at 36%. There are two other elections I want to just spend a minute talking about. One is the Macron-Le Pen election in 2017. And this was the second round election there between those two survivors of the first round. The top two candidates run off in the second round. Polarization there was lower than I expected it to be, at about 26%. Turkey had, in 2014, it was the first popularly elected Erdogan election, who is also one of these authoritarian leaders. The polarization there was at 29%. In all of these countries, by the way, Hungary, the US, Brazil, France, and Turkey, the deepest polarization is between voters who live in rural areas and small towns versus those who live in large cities and metropolitan areas. That's something all throughout Europe has been a basic polarization line. Didn't used to be that way. In many countries, it used to be religious polarization or polarization between people who were religious and those who were secular. Sometimes it was polarization along class lines, working class versus middle and upper class. Now the primary driver of polarization in those countries, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on, is this urban-rural split. Clearly in this country, but in other countries as well. Okay, there is again, and you can pick out your favorite country, and if you have questions about it, I'd be glad to talk about it to the extent that I know anything about those particular elections. And then there's limited polarization in 25 of the elections. The US I've already talked about, well below recent levels. All the ones on figure 1B are below 21% in terms of polarization. In 17 of those country elections, polarization is very, very low. It's under 15%, with extreme polarization under 5%. And so the bottom line is that there's a lot of variation in polarization across the world, and even across the democratic world. Not all of the countries in our surveys would qualify as democratic countries. But polarization goes from the extreme of, upwards of 50%, all the way down to virtually 0%. That's a wide, wide range. Okay, let me go on beyond that. And I should have said at the outset, by the way, if you have questions about what do I mean by something, or I need to clarify something, please raise your hand and let me know, and I can do that at that point. If you have other kinds of questions or comments, save them up for afterwards, and we'll have, I hope, a good Q&A session afterwards. If you want to throw tomatoes, hold on to them until I'm out of the room, and then you're quite welcome to let loose if you want to. Okay, I want to talk just a little bit about the U.S., and I'm going to cover some ground that I covered yesterday. So if you are here, or were here yesterday, you will find this to be familiar. I'm going to look at extreme polarization, higher in 2012 to 2020, especially in the two most recent presidential elections. It's driven more by negative evaluations of opposing leaders. We hate more than we love, and that shows up not only in the United States, but it shows up in a lot of these other countries also. 2020 was different. 70% of Democrats were extremely negative towards Trump. 40% of Republicans were extremely negative towards Biden. I think those figures in our 2024 survey will be even higher than that. I think that's going to be a much more deeply polarized election. Though, of course, everything is up in the air right now. We don't really know who both candidates are going to be in 2024, certainly on the Democratic side, and we could talk more about that later on if you want me to. And we don't really know what the context is going to be. It seems like every week brings a different dynamic to the election, although the polls don't change a lot over time. It's almost as if voters are simply waiting to see what's going to happen. Many of them have already made up their minds what they're going to do, but some haven't yet, and they're kind of waiting to see how things crystallize over time. Among all voters, and I'm just was looking at partisans before, people who are either Democrats or Republicans in the United States at least, Trump is seen more negatively overall by 39% of everybody than Biden at 21%. This is again for 2020. But Trump is seen contrastingly more positively, 15% put him at 100 degrees than Biden at 10%. And that's the figure that I drew these particular figures from. And you'll see there, and I'm just going to talk about this very quickly, that 2016 and 2020 are different. 2016 and 2020, polarization really breaks out from what it was in previous years. And it really wasn't very high in previous years. One year where it was high is 1972. And this was the election in which Richard Nixon won by a landslide. The Democratic candidate in 1972 was George McGovern, a very unpopular candidate, not even somebody that a lot of Democrats were willing to support. And you could see that here, that Republicans, right here, the solid red line in 1972, were almost 30% at 100 for Richard Nixon. They weren't there 2 years later, but they were there in 1972. And you could see that Republicans, just by a slightly lower percentage, were at 0 for George McGovern, the Democratic nominees. Democrats on the other side, as I said before, were not all that enthusiastic about their Democratic nominee, and they weren't enthusiastic about Richard Nixon either, which is what you, of course, would expect. Okay, that's the U.S. I want to do something that kind of highlights or drills down into these data. 51 country elections is a lot for you to digest. And so I thought I would select 4 different ones and talk a little bit about them and what the contrasts are there. And the one that is my favorite contrast to make is between the United States in 2020, Biden versus Trump, and Brazil in 2022, Lula versus Bolsonaro. And it's a good contrast to dwell on because Trump and Bolsonaro were virtual twins. They were twins in several ways. They were both self-styled populists. They both opposed the governing party, the party that had been in power in the previous election. They both lost their bids for re-election. Bolsonaro was the president of Brazil. Trump, of course, was the president of the United States. Trump lost 51 to 47% to Biden. Bolsonaro lost 51 to 49% to Lula. Both claimed, both before the election and afterwards, that the election was fraudulent. Both of them challenged the result. Neither one of them conceded they're lost. Both of them condoned violence to overturn the election. You all will remember the films from Capitol Hill on January 6th of 2021. Well, there were similar films in Brasilia, which was the Brazilian capital, right after Bolsonaro had lost that election. People attacking the police there, Bolsonaro supporters, hurling bombs and rocks through the various governmental buildings in Brasilia. There was a countrywide trucker strike. Truckers were heavily in favor of Bolsonaro in the Brazilian electorate, and they simply shut down commerce for several days by blocking the roads there. So very, very similar, the twins, I call them, very similar candidates there. Bolsonaro was characterized as the Trump of the tropics. Trump had endorsed him for his reelection. They shared campaign advisors. One of them, probably the most notable or notorious of them maybe, Steve Bannon, was the top advisor for the Bolsonaro campaign after he had been a top advisor to the Trump campaign in 2020. And both of them recently were featured speakers at the CPAC conference, it's Conservative Political Action Committee. Both of them were there. They got widespread applause there. So again, twins, Bolsonaro and Trump. I also wanted to talk a little bit about France. It was moderately polarized at, I said before, 26% of the electorate, 11% extremely polarized. The second round election was one where Macron won about 2/3 of the vote, 66% of the vote. Le Pen won about 1/3 of the vote. In the first round, they were closer to each other. Macron at 24%, Le Pen at 21%. Le Pen was the candidate of I'm blanking on the name, the National Rally Party, which was a neo-fascist party. Much more fascistic in terms of its orientation when her dad was the leader of the party. She got rid of him. She purged him from the party, actually, and kind of took over to put a more friendly face on the party. They were running just a few weeks ago in national parliamentary elections. The Le Pen party, I said it before, National Rally Party, basically came in first in that election with about 1/3 of the vote. In second place was a center-left coalition. In third place was Macron's party. But it's Macron and Le Pen who are now facing off in the runoff. The estimate is that Le Pen's party, she has another candidate running, as one analyst put it in one of the Parisian newspapers, she found a pretty face to put at the top of that party, though she is now pretty much controlling things in the party. That party, by the way, has been heavily financed by Putin in Russia because he wants to really shake up the French party system. But the estimate anyway, this is where I was headed, is that Le Pen's party will come very close to winning a majority of the parliament, but may not succeed in passing that majority threshold. And then the question is what happens next. And I think that the money probably is being placed on some kind of coalition between Macron's party and the center-left coalition of parties, and it's several parties there. And that'll be an interesting result, and we'll have to see what happens as a result of that. Macron is not a favorite of the center-left. They don't like him very well. On the other hand, they seem to like Le Pen even less than that. The other contrast that I wanted to spend some time talking about is Germany. In the 2017 election, an election where we ran a survey, Germany had very little polarization. This was a contest between Angela Merkel, remember her, long-standing chancellor in Germany, and I don't even remember Scholz's first name, but he got 21% of the vote. Merkel won 33% of the vote, and the government was run by her party. The alternative for Deutschland, the alternative for Germany, got 13% of the vote. It is a neo-Nazi party. And it's done much better in succeeding elections, to the point now where it is the second leading parliament, or second leading party in the German parliament, the Bundestag. And it also, in recent state elections, was able to win the governor's position in some of the former Eastern German states in Germany. So it's a party on the rise, but it still is not really achieving the levels of support that either of the two major parties are achieving, the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats. The driving issue in France, the driving issue in Germany in those elections, but even more so since then, the driving issue, or at least one of them in our elections, is immigration. It is a reaction to immigration, and to immigration that many people, many of the natives in those countries, feel is too much and needs to be gotten under control. So there are similarities there between Germany, France on the one hand, and the US on the other hand, but the contrast is actually pretty sharp in terms of levels of polarization. Brazil, I think I'm right in saying, doesn't have much immigration, so that's not really an issue there. The primary issue there was religion, was evangelicals versus more traditional mainstream, not so much Protestants, but probably Catholics. Okay. The CNEP average, by the way, across all these countries was 2% in terms of polarization. So it's 2% versus the US at one extreme, or Mozambique or Brazil at the other extreme. And this is what I've talked about. Here you see Brazil and the US really breaking out from the pack down here, where you see France and Germany, and then the all CNEP average right here in the blue line that is right there. Up a little bit, but still not really very high. Okay. Now, let me turn into some of the explanations that have been offered for polarization. Why do we have it? Why is it so high in some places but not in others? One thing we're able to do in our CNEP studies is take a look at how some countries have changed over time. We have 13 countries in which we have done multiple surveys, and we can compare the earlier surveys with the later ones. And there is consistently high polarization in the United States, except for 1992. And we didn't have surveys between 1992 and 2004, but I know from other data in other surveys that it's continued to climb during that period of time. South Africa is another country that has had fairly high levels of polarization, except in 2019 for reasons I could get into, but I don't really have the time to right now. Hungary is another one that, at least in the two surveys that we did, had fairly high levels of polarization. Consistently low polarization, Indonesia, Spain, Italy, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Hong Kong, by the way, we no longer survey because Hong Kong has been absorbed by China, and there's no reason to do surveys there. And in fact, the firm that was doing surveys for us there has been basically disbanded. And I think one of the principals in it has been arrested for opposing mainland China, so we're not going to go back there. The conclusion is that polarization is more the property of a particular election than inherent in a particular country. And also that polarization seems to be more widespread now than it was in earlier years. And there you have to do kind of the gymnastics if you look at figures 1A and 1B and take a look at what the years are and then compare the years before, I don't know, 2010 and after 2010. Okay, let me talk about some more causes of polarization. Some of these countries have presidential elections where the government leader and the opposition leader are people that everyone in the country is voting on, pro or con or some other vote. Some of them, about half of them, are parliamentary elections where nobody is voting on the national leader. Instead, they're voting on members of parliament, legislators in their constituency. And then whichever party gains a majority of the legislature, of the parliament, is electing the prime minister. Think Britain. You know, Britain is a great example of that. And so the question becomes, do presidential elections create more polarization than parliamentary elections? And the answer is that they do. Presidential elections tend to augment polarization, tend to lead to more polarization. If you think about it, it's pretty easy to imagine why. Because people are focused on a particular leader that they are voting for or against. Whereas in a parliamentary election, they are not. Also, polarization is generally lower where you have multiple parties contending for power in a country. And the reason probably is that if you have multiple parties, people are having different views of the different parties. Some of those parties may be joining with one another in coalitions, so you don't want to hate them if you have to, at the second round or at some other point in the parliament, join with them in creating a majority of government. Contentious leaders in their campaigns stoke polarization. And in fact, the evidence is pretty clear that most voters, certainly in this country, but in some of these other countries as well, take their cues from the leaders. And if the leaders express hate towards their opponent, their voters will also express hate towards their opponents. And so if you're drawing the arrow of causality, the arrow goes from leaders and what leaders are saying and how they're conducting their campaigns to followers, to people who are identifiers with that particular party. There's also been an emergence of right-wing populist leaders in many of the Western democracies. Trump probably would fall into this category, though in some ways he's not really a populist, but certainly anti-establishment would be, I think, a good way to characterize him, certainly in 2016. There's been an emergence of these kinds of leaders. They are getting more and more voter support over time in France, in Germany, in Italy. In fact, the leader in Italy now is somebody from the right-wing former fascist party in Italy. And she's turned out to be fairly moderate as she's been in office, at least the few months that she's been in office, but she does indeed come from that party that was a party of the far right. Where the leaders are engaging in toxic campaigns and attacking the opposition in venomous ways, there tends to be more polarization. Again, leaders are the ones who are basically cueing the public and their followers how to see these candidates. Also, some of these are countries with deep tribal, ethnic, racial, or religious divisions. And these tend to be reflected in the vote patterns in those countries. In the United States, probably the deepest religion, well, there are two different ones. Deepest division are probably twofold. One along racial lines, blacks versus whites. Another one along religious lines, evangelicals versus people who are not religious, who are secular or mainstream religion. Very sharp differences there. In Mozambique, as I said before, it was tribal. In some places, it's ethnic divisions. In other places, it is divisions along working class versus middle class lines. Those are divisions of the past, really, not so much of present times. All of those kinds of divisions promote polarization. The media plays a role here. Certainly does in this country, but it does in other countries as well. With cable television in particular, and the internet, it's easier for voters to find support for their views. These are echo chambers. You know who you want to hear from, who you want to get your news from, if you have pretty strong partisan views, and you go to those sources. Back when I was growing up, and when many people in this room were growing up, you really didn't have those kinds of sources available. You had what? The big three, the broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. They all were televised at about the same time in the evening. They all were basically bringing you the same news. They all bent over backwards to try to present the news in a balanced way. and you really couldn't take cues from them as to which candidate you could support. And then cable news came along. We moved from what is called by communications specialists broadcasting to narrowcasting. And you could seek out stations on television or on the radio that were very much reinforcing the kinds of views that you had. And if you had strong partisan views, indeed you wanted to hear those echoes out there in the media that you were paying attention to and deriving your information from. There's some examples of this from our past. U.S. newspapers in the 19th century were partisan, heavily partisan, usually party organs financed by the parties. So when we lived in Florida, we read the Tallahassee Democrat, which until the 1960s was a pro-democratic newspaper. If you lived in Columbus, as we do now, the Columbus Dispatch was a very pro-Republican newspaper, and its owners made no bones about being pro-Republican. Well, that's changed over time. The newspapers in the 20th century figured out that they could make more money if they appealed to everybody. They could get more advertising if they appealed to everybody. And so they began to move in the direction of, like TV, kind of broadcasting, or at least broadening the base of readership there. But you can go to other sources, particularly if you pay attention to social media, or if you use the internet to get your news, you can find the kind of information that you want to reinforce your views there. So the media is one of the actors that has created more polarization in this country and in many of the European countries as well, where the media is fairly well developed. Another example, if any of you British have visited Britain lately and picked up some of the tabloids there, you will recognize that these are partisan papers. And British understand that, and they factor that in. Some people would never read the Murdoch papers in Britain or Australia, for that matter, because they know they're going to get right-wing propaganda. On the other hand, there's some voters who delight in reading those newspapers. And so that is maybe a symbol of what things used to be in this country in terms of newspapers. There also are echo chambers to be found in who we discuss politics with. And in fact, more and more. And this has been an area of my own research. I've been very interested in knowing how discussion networks can foster polarization or foster tolerance, for that matter. And so one thing that I've looked at pretty carefully using the CNEP data that we have, and it's only in the CNEP that we have access to that kind of data, using data that takes a look at people with whom we discuss things. And one measure that I like to use is a question that asks, who do you discuss important matters with? And people are asked to name up to 2 or 3 people that they discuss important matters with. And then they're also separately asked about their spouse. So the important matters discussions are not spouses necessarily. Well, they could be, but we wanted to look at spouses separately. So we ask that question of people, and then we say, well, okay, do you discuss politics with them? And in many cases, they do. These are people they discuss a lot of issues with them, and politics may be one of them. And then the question that we get at is whether they agree. And we ask them to estimate who the people who were their intimate discussants, these 2, actually voted for in that particular election. And most people, by the way, will tell us that. They have no bones about saying that. They've gotten to know the interviewer so well, I guess, that they're willing to divulge that kind of information. And then, of course, we take a look at what the respondent in our survey has said about who they voted for, and we compare them. And the figure that I want to show you next is this one that draws upon, I think it's about 40 different country surveys there. We don't have it for all the countries that were in our previous ones. And again, if you turn your head sideways, you can probably read the horizontal axis there. And what we're looking at there is, remember, these are intimate discussants, people with whom they discuss important matters. And the question is, do you agree with them or don't you agree with them? And there are three different possibilities, well, really four different possibilities. One of them is the empty space up above, and those are people who do not discuss politics with their intimate discussants, okay? So you need to bear that in mind. And then the three colored bars there are where all of the discussants agree with our respondent. There's complete homogeneity within that particular discussion network. Where they are divided, one agrees, the other one disagrees. And then thirdly, both of them disagree. And you can see very quickly that agreeing with both of them is the most common feature across almost all of these countries. And I'll come to some of the exceptions in just a minute because they're interesting to think about. Some of these are split, where your intimate discussants are, in one case, agreeing with you, in the other case, not agreeing with you. In a few cases, both of them disagree with you, and those would be interesting ones to explore, and we've done a little bit of that, which is revealing in some ways. I want to point out the United States here, and you'll see that we, of course, have this survey in 1992, and it's split almost 50-50 between 30% of people who are in discussion networks with intimates where there is full agreement versus some kind of disagreement, either a mix or both of them disagreeing. If you go to the United States in 2020, look what happens. We are much more embedded in these personal discussion networks that are echo chambers, that are agreements. Over 50% of Americans, that's the figure right there at the top of that blue bar, over 50% of Americans, when they're talking to intimates about politics, are talking to intimates with whom they agree. And so I remember talking some years ago, I was teaching a class that met on Wednesday afternoon at 3:30. And we were meeting the day before Thanksgiving. And being, of course, a wise professor, I recognized that nobody would be there that afternoon. They would all be headed home for Thanksgiving break. And so I said to them in my generosity, I said, well, I'm going to cancel class on Wednesday afternoon, but on one condition. And the condition is that over the Thanksgiving dinner table, you talk about party politics with everybody who is there. And I looked out on this sea of faces in the classroom, and I could see anguish on their face. And they're thinking, oh no, Uncle John is going to be there. And we don't want to set him off because it's going to be just awful. And then when they came back the following Monday after Thanksgiving break, I said, well, I want to take just a simple poll. Would you raise your hand if you discussed, it was a party politics class, parties and elections class. I want you to raise your hand if you followed my condition and actually discussed politics at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Not a single hand went up in that class. And I understood why, because I didn't do it either. So anyway, and you can kind of range through this to see the different countries. There are a few of them where there is more disagreement than agreement, but very few. I think the number is 8, perhaps. I've got it here someplace. Let me go back. 8 elections. The most polarized electorates, we already talked about. Yes, go ahead. About politics. Yeah, they talk to these discussants because they've named them. But we ask them, do you discuss politics? And a lot of them say, oh, no, we don't discuss politics with those people. Yeah, and that number is fairly high in some countries. Yes? No, that was George Bush Sr. versus Carter, versus Clinton, with Ross Perot as the third-party candidate. Ross Perot, by the way, who was in the 30% range in June before he dropped out of the campaign, and some of you will remember this. And then he came back in later on that summer, never achieved that level, but ended up with about 20% of the vote in the 1992 election. But yeah, that was the Perot-Clinton, George H.W. Bush election. Okay, other questions? Okay, let me just talk about the most polarized electorates, the ones we've already talked about, the US, Brazil, South Africa, Mozambique, most embedded in echo chambers. So the echo chambers are reinforcing people's partisan views, people's polarization there. And to come back to the point that he raised and that she raised as well, many people don't discuss politics with their intimates. It's too dangerous, maybe. Or they don't really care about politics, and it's not going to be a matter of discussion. They may want to talk about the Guardians or the Reds or the Browns or the Buckeyes, and that probably is common talk around the Thanksgiving dinner table, but they don't dare raise Democrats and Republicans and talk about those kinds of subjects. Okay. Let me come to some conclusions here, and then we can go to questions and answers. First, polarization is not widespread in recent decades across all of these various countries that we have studied. One limiting feature, and I've already kind of alluded to this, is that politics is not a prime motivator for many people. They just want to stay away from it. They're not interested in it. Even if a third are polarized, though, and they are politically active, that makes for a very contentious politics. And so I don't know if the third is a natural dividing line there. 50% surely is. But there's some line between maybe a third and 50% where you get into this dangerous territory where polarization is really kind of dominating that particular election. What are its consequences? Where you have more polarized elections and more polarized politicians, more polarized officials, it's difficult to get party agreement, or policy agreement, I mean to say, across party lines. And that means that difficult issues can't be compromised very easily because the other side is going to attack you if you take the wrong position on that particular issue. When election outcomes are close, you have transitions from one party to another in controlling the government that can be pretty sharp. You can go from a Democratic government in 2016 to a Republican government dominated by President Trump from 2017 to 2020, back in this case, a divided government after 2020. As there are these shifts in control of government, where elections are close, you're going to get shifts. Where there are these shifts, the new party coming in wants to undo what the previous party did. And there are plenty of examples of this. You hear them now in the 2020 election campaign, where the Republican erstwhile nominee, Donald Trump, is talking about all the things he's going to undo if he is elected as president. You heard this in the 2020 campaign, where Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, said there are all these things I'm going to undo if elected president in the 2020 election. This is really not a good thing for policy, to lurch back and forth. The best example of this, by the way, is one that's been raised again in the 2024 contest, and that's over the Affordable Care Act. Whereas Donald Trump is now saying, one of the first things I will do as president if I'm elected in 2024 is I'll get rid of Obamacare. And of course, Biden is saying, I would do just the reverse. I would strengthen it over time. And of course, we came one vote short, right? In 2017 or 18 it was, I forget exactly the year, whereas Obamacare almost was killed. One vote short. It was John McCain standing up on the Senate floor. You'll remember him going like that, where he was going to vote no on this legislation. When one party dominates, and you see this not so much at the national level, but in many of the states, when one party dominates things, you begin to see much more extremist legislation coming forward, much more in the direction of authoritarian control. You see more violence in campaigns when there is polarized politics. The stakes are really high, and so you want to make sure that the other side isn't able to take power. And then most of the public gets turned off. Say, I don't want to hear about this anymore. I'm not sure I want to even vote in these elections. I don't like either side. I don't like the contentious nature of our politics. And of course, this is a very bad thing for democracy. Democracy doesn't function when most voters don't have much faith in how it operates. Well, let me stop at that point. I think there is some time for Q&A, and I see people roaming down the hallways with microphones. So just raise your hand and ask your question, and I won't promise to be able to answer it, but I will address it.
Being that your surveys cover a period of 35 to 40 years, do you feel that political polarization is a cyclical thing and that eventually we're going to get out of it? I mean, what does past history show, maybe going back 100 years?
Well, the quick answer is we don't know for sure. My guess would be, we don't have public opinion surveys prior to the 1940s, really the 1950s. If we did, my guess would be that we would find that there was a lot of polarization, maybe more than even today, in the immediate post-Civil War period, where people were killing each other, after all, during the Civil War, and a lot of hatred on both sides, particularly in the South, but also in the North. What I do know, and I showed these data yesterday, if some of you were here, you may have seen them. What I do know is how people were voting in the Congress over a period from 1879 all the way to 2023. And that curve essentially is very high after the Civil War, and then it goes way, way down into the 1920s, and then begins to go back up in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, to the point that it's higher today than it was in that immediate post-Civil War period. And that's leaders. My guess is that voters followed them in those views. So there was a lot of polarization probably in the tail end of the 19th century in this country. It kind of falls off over time, and then it's come back up since the 1930s, and certainly since the 1960s and 70s. Other questions?
Yeah, back here. So you described your surveys as affective questioning, right?
Yes.
Something like that? Okay, as opposed to thought questioning, like
Yeah, it's feeling. It's feelings that,
Right.
that we're recording.
And since emotions are neither right or wrong, they're always just what they are. You can't argue emotions.
That's right.
Wouldn't it be more prudent to ask a person's thought about this rather than emotion? Because emotions will be polarizing, won't they? Because you can't argue them.
Yeah, I don't know what thought would mean. Now, we do ask about issues. And
But
we
you ask
can-
how they feel about them, not what they think about them.
Yeah. Well, we ask people in the case of ideology, whether you're a
And
conservative.
doesn't ideology polarize people?
And it does.
Yeah.
And it does. It tracks pretty much what you've
So you're
seen
looking
here.
for polarization when you do these things.
Yeah. Yeah, you can measure polarization in a whole variety of ways. The reason we do affective polarization is that political psychologists have told us that people now are thinking of the political parties, at least in the US, as their identities, as their tribe, in effect. And they're very loyal to their tribe. So if a candidate from their tribe says or takes a particular position on issue X, that's their position. And they're loyal to them, and they're not going to bend from that. And there's an extensive literature that is looking at identity and how partisanship now has become a part of somebody's identity, if they're partisans. And the other thing that's been interesting here is that one of the dividing lines that I mentioned before in American politics is between evangelicals and others, including seculars and mainstream religious people. Well, it turns out that many of the evangelicals now are much more likely to belong to not the evangelical tribe, but the conservative Republican tribe. And so it's almost as if their evangelical faith has been transmuted into a partisan or political faith, and the two are kind of traveling together there.
That's okay. That's a second question.
Sure.
Is sort of,
You're
goes right into
entitled
that.
to a second
So,
question.
Yeah. Well, so you said the leader of Hungary was a socialist and then he flipped all the way to the opposite side, extreme far right? How often does that happen?
Well, he became a populist after that. He's
So is it
shown
more likely that he became a communist? He shifted
no, not a
farther left?
he was anti-communist all along. He was a socialist.
You said he's a socialist, though.
He opposed the communists because Hungary, remember, was part of the Warsaw Pact.
Right.
When the Warsaw Pact ended, there was still a communist party in Hungary, but it wasn't a very popular party because it was allied with the former Soviet Union. And so Orban emerges. He was, I'm not going to remember all the details here, but he got a fellowship to go to either Oxford or Cambridge in Britain. The fellowship was financed by a very prominent, George Soros is his name, very prominent progressive. Orban at that time identified as a socialist, but we need to remember that the Nazis were what? The National Socialists.
Right.
So they were a nationalist party, but they also were socialist in some degrees, very anti-communist. And
But at the
Orban,
extremes, not much difference.
I'm sorry?
At the extremes, not much difference.
I think that
Both killed their own people.
there was a time when there wasn't a lot of difference. But I think the socialists in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Empire were really like social democrats in some of the Scandinavian countries. Very supportive of a social safety net for people, as were the Nazis, by the way, because the Nazis were the National Socialists. So it all gets kind of muddied up there. Orban has, I think, seen that his political advantage is by declaring himself to be anti-establishment. And so he now is a populist. He's somebody who also, I think, gave a talk at the CPAC conference. And he now is regarded as one of the most authoritarian rulers in the world. Yes, another question here.
Looking at what you did
Mm-hmm.
Between democracies and parliament, and
Or presidential
parliamentary are
yeah.
less polarized, and yet when we're looking at them, it looks like just a chaotic mess. You can't begin to think that your guy's going to get elected, and if he does, that he won't be capitalized by some other parties or something. But did you come away preferring democracy or parliamentary governments with what you've seen?
Okay, and I think you mean to say preferring presidential
Yes.
elections to parliamentary
Yes.
elections. You know, each of them has advantages. Some countries, France is one that has both. The elections that are taking place in France right now are parliamentary contests. Macron, on the other hand, was elected in a presidential contest. The French, after several decades of a mess with their parliament, decided they wanted to elect presidents. They may be now thinking twice about that. We'll see. I don't have a strong preference either way. I think each has its advantages. One of the advantages of a multi-party system that has parliamentary elections is the parties are forced to form coalitions. They're forced to compromise, to seek partners when they are in government. And that's probably a good thing. On the other hand, if one of those partners is a fascist party, as may be the situation in France or in Germany in future years, I might think twice about that. Yes.
I noticed that Hong Kong is on here a couple of times. Are you still able to operate there? And how do you tell when you can add a country or when you need to subtract one?
Well, we take the surveys that are offered to us. And if somebody says, one of these principal investigators in another country, these are almost all academics, saying we want to do a survey in, I guess the most recent one was Argentina. We want to do a survey in Argentina. We will say, absolutely, we would welcome you as a part of CNEP if you will ask the 100 or so questions that we use as standard questions there. And they're usually willing to do that. Every once in a while, it's hard to find somebody to do a survey in a particular country. We fished around to try to find somebody we could do a survey with in Britain in its most recent election. And in fact, we were ready to go to the National Science Foundation to get funding to conduct our own survey in Britain. It turns out they didn't have any money. because their appropriation had not yet been finalized for this year by Congress. And so they said, we're sorry, we just can't do that. They had financed our 2017 survey in Britain, and so we were very hopeful to be able to add Britain in 2024 to our set. Hong Kong's a different story. We had, and I think I may have said this in passing before, that we had a partner in Hong Kong who was regularly interested in running CNEP surveys there until China basically took over. And that partner, not himself, but his colleague who ran the survey firm, was arrested for anti-Chinese sentiments. And I don't know what's happened to him. So obviously, no Hong Kong survey. And it really wouldn't be relevant anymore because those are not free elections in Hong Kong. So we included it in there. We do, by the way, have, and I don't think it's in these data here, we have a Chinese survey, mainland China. And that survey was financed by, I think it was Duke University. And there was a colleague of ours in the CNEP project who was a faculty member at Duke. And so he was able to find money there to do the survey. They would not allow us, the Chinese government, to do a survey of their national elections. First, they don't have any. Secondly, they didn't want us asking questions of people. What do you think of the chairman of the Communist Party on a scale of 0 to 100? Most Chinese, I think, would probably not have wanted to answer that question. We do have a Russian survey where we ask that question about Putin. And I just imagine sometimes that somebody is getting this phone call in the middle of the night or a pounding on the door saying, we noticed that you answered this survey 2 weeks ago where you said you didn't really like Putin very well. Are you sure about that position? No, I didn't ever say that. They misquoted me there. So, we have that issue, obviously, and we don't have Hong Kong surveys anymore. I'm not inclined to pay much attention to the Russian survey, mainly because I think that people would be idiotic to answer honestly in that survey, although I'm always amazed that people are pretty honest when they tell us their views. And one way we test this is that we ask people, did you vote in this election? And people are inclined to fudge that a little bit. Nobody wants to appear that they're not voting in an election. But whether they voted or not is a public record. And we check the records. And there is a small slice of people, not very large, who are telling us they voted who really didn't vote. Now, maybe their vote wasn't recorded, and that's a possibility. But we think they just were embarrassed to admit to an interviewer that they hadn't participated in this very important election. Yes, yes, back here.
I had a couple questions. One was, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about the recent Indian election, which seems so complicated. It's hard to wrap my mind around all the number of parties they have. I was just also, I'm somebody who's done a lot of poll work, as a poll worker, election, which I find to be a wonderful bipartisan experience.
Yes.
And I wonder if you have any way of doing data on the percentage of the public that is involved in bipartisan activities and how that affects polarization.
Okay, two things. I'm not an expert on India, but my understanding of India is that the Modi party, which is a Hindu nationalist party, is basically a coalition of very powerful state parties, each of which has its own mind, in a sense. What happened in the most recent election is that coalition somewhat fell apart. And Modi didn't do as well as everybody expected him to, including Modi himself. And so it was kind of an embarrassment to his Hindu nationalist party. He now, I think I'm right in saying, and some of you may know this better than I do, I think I'm right in saying that he now has to try to stitch together a governing coalition. That may not be easy to do, because the way you do it, the time-honored way of doing that, is you offer things to people to get them to join your coalition. And he's going to offer them some things that he may not want to offer, but may have to offer. And so we'll see going forward how that's going to work out. As to your second question, we asked people a battery of questions about the kinds of political activities they engage in. We hadn't really thought, and I'm glad you asked that question, we hadn't thought to ask them about bipartisan activities. We focused more on campaign-related activities. Now, the truth is, they're probably in a national sample of, I don't know, 12 to 1,500 people, and that's the size of our US samples. There probably only are a very small handful of people who have actually worked at the polls in a bipartisan way. But we ought to give them the opportunity to tell us that, and it would be interesting to know the answer to that. Other question? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I was reading a book on polarization in the United States, and the author talked about talk radio and social media, and specifically mentioned the era of Rush Limbaugh as a real start of the polarization
Yes.
back in the 90s. Do you have any comments on that and the effectiveness? And do you ask any questions of the people that you survey as to do they listen to talk radio or what television stations they listen to and that type of thing?
We have a whole battery of questions that ask people what television news they watch, what radio they listen to. Stations are a difficulty because every locale has its own stations, basically. We did at one point have a Rush Limbaugh question specifically that we asked of people, and there was a considerable number of people who reported that they were regular listeners to Rush Limbaugh. We also asked them what newspapers they pay attention to on a regular basis. Again, it's the same problem, well, not quite the same problem. It is a challenge because newspapers are more localized. Used to be anyway, less so anymore, I guess. But we have all that information, and we're able to analyze that. Now think of the challenges of analyzing that across 51 different country elections. And nobody really has made use of those data in an effective way. I've tried in some ways to do that, but the data are there. It would really be interesting to be able to pursue them. But I think that Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck after him were very, very important in terms of creating these kinds of, in this case, right-wing echo chambers, where people were turning to them on a regular basis for their news and getting their news almost entirely from those particular radio sources. And these, of course, are the people who are the most polarized, or at least the most extreme in their attitudes towards one party and one set of candidates. And there are similar sources on the left. They just are not as widespread, and they don't have the audiences that Rush Limbaugh had in his day, or that Glenn Beck had in his day. One back here, and then we'll go here.
So I'm a minister, and I have a congregation that has a diverse political spread.
You have a challenge, right?
And a blessing, both.
Mm-hmm.
And I have been looking for resources on how to conduct good dialogue. I've used Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind before, but I was looking around and I saw that OSU has a political or a civil dialogue kind of initiative, and I wondered if you are in contact with them or if you have any resources to recommend.
It's run by my political science colleague, Michael Neblo. And Michael Neblo is a strong believer and has done a lot of research on the power of discourse and discourse across lines of difference. And he's been very successful in being able to run experiments where he brings groups together and gets them to talk across party lines, ideological lines, and the like. And I know they have a website, and you may be able to take a look at that website. If you have further questions, send me an email. It's mech.9@osu.edu, and I'd be glad to ask Michael what he would suggest. There's a question right here.
This might be sort of related. I thought I heard you make a distinction between elections that were polarized versus contentious. Did I hear you say that?
I didn't mean to make that distinction
Oh, okay.
necessarily. Contentious, I was using that to refer more to campaigns,
Okay.
where the opponents in campaigns are bitterly attacking each other, or it could come from one side for that matter, but they become very contentious. So much so, and in fact, I'll use an anecdote to illustrate this. They become much so contentious that most of us are saying, we don't want to hear this anymore. You know, we're so tired of this fighting that's going on. And the anecdote is that I had a friend who was visiting from Massachusetts, and he came to Ohio, and I think it was before the 2012, or maybe the 2016 election. He said, oh, I'm so glad to be here in Columbus because I don't get to see any TV ads about the candidates in Massachusetts because we're a one-party state, and nobody's going to spend money to try to persuade voters in Massachusetts to vote for one party or the other. And after about 3 days, he said, I am so happy to be going back to Massachusetts, so tired of these ads that don't really enlighten anybody in any way. They're just so negative. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just say in that regard, and the question from in the back, my advice as a person who specializes in social perspective taking is do far less telling and more asking, right? Listen. I had a discussion today with a friend of mine who is in a different party, and she said, I really prefer amendments to the Ohio Constitution. This was after this morning's talk, rather than changing the Constitution. And I said, tell me why you feel that way. And her answer was very interesting. It was because it's easier to change an amendment, which gets us right back into this, you know, well, when you're not in office, the opposition party is going to change. And they spend more time changing that than actually working on policies that help the people.
You know, I was thinking as she was talking of another anecdote that I want to share with you, and that is that it's the result of a research study where there was a survey conducted in the late 1950s in this country and 4 other countries around the world. And the question was, if your daughter, and it was daughter, were to marry somebody of the other party, how would you think about that? And Americans basically said, this was late 1950s, they basically said, they didn't use that word, but they said, whatever, who cares? If my daughter finds a good husband, I don't care what he is. The question was asked in Italy as well. And in Italy, people who were Christian Democrats, which was the dominant party in Italy in that particular decade, said we would be outraged by that because the contending party is the Communist Party. And this means that our daughter would be marrying an anti-religious, secularist, Soviet-style communist. Well, that question was asked again in the last decade. And Americans in the 2010s, I guess it would have been, are saying, a majority of them, we would not be very happy if our daughter, and again it was daughter, were to marry somebody of the other party. What a big change that is. And that's polarization, right? And that's an earmark of polarization. And I actually know of couples who had, dating couples who have broken up because they couldn't get across the partisan division there, and they couldn't somehow render that neutral and talk about other things. Yes?
It's my position that over time, the country has had probably 4 or 5 or more serious political fights. And they would go through periods of relative calm. You know, when de Tocqueville came to this country, he couldn't get enough of it.
Yes.
And he didn't comment much on politics. Wasn't much politics going on in 1820. And then things got more contentious around wars or principles and so forth, and certainly during the time leading up to the Civil War, we changed our party structure. The Republican Party was invented. Now it seems to be falling apart, and there are probably elements of the Republican Party that hate other elements of the Republican Party more than they hate the Democrats.
Yes, yes.
So we always seem to get through it. No. Okay. And so my question to you is, what leads us in that direction now? We have a serious rift in the Republican Party, more so than the Democrats. We have two octogenarians running for president, or near octogenarians.
Yeah.
One lies all the time, and the other one can't find the right word sometimes. So where do we go from here?
Well, my hope, and it's a hope, is that polarization gets dampened down over time. As voters tire of it and maybe realize that it doesn't get us anywhere, that hasn't happened yet, but the hope is that we will get to that point. And we have had periods where we've had deep-seated polarization, and then somehow we put that behind us. Though I'm reminded there's a new book by Eric Larson that some of you may know about, and I don't remember the exact title, but it's about the first days of the Lincoln administration back in the 1861, and about how hateful Southerners were towards the North and towards Lincoln. And of course, it led to his assassination. And there were attempted assassinations before. He takes the train to go to D.C. to assume, to get to the White House. And they had to disguise the route because they were afraid he was going to be targeted for assassination along the route. And whether that was true or not, I don't know, but they were really worried about that. But the point I want to make here is that there are these hatreds that sometimes don't go away, at least not in the initial generation of hatred. And then the kids come along and they're thinking, why do my parents feel this way? I don't feel that way anymore. So things change over time, and sometimes it takes a long time for that to happen.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much.